Well, we'll respect everyone's time and we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you tonight. I'm Chad Cooper. I'm the Executive Director of Sustainable Sanctuary Coalition, and we're excited to have you tonight via Zoom. And before I continue, I'm going to turn it over to one of our co-hosts, Jerry Reese, who is on the Environmental Action Committee at Village Church. And so, Jerry, any words of wisdom you'd like to share tonight?
Well, I think we're moving, as we move towards spring, we're beginning to look at the ground. We got Jim Turner, Stan Slaughter, and one other person going to talk about what they're trying to do at Westport Presbyterian Church in the way of enhancing soil. I think tonight we have Karen Ramsey talking about Composting 101. In my Sunday school class, we recently studied a man by the name of Reverend Michael Dowd. One of the things he emphasized a couple times during eight sessions was he thinks the important thing for him is to plant trees and build topsoil. That's the two things he's trying to accomplish in life, besides convincing people of his thoughts.
Good. Thanks for sharing. And now Diane, she's with Earth Keepers with the Presbyterian Church. So Diane, any words of wisdom for us?
Well, I would say that this doesn't relate to other denominations or faiths, but our Presbyterian National Denomination is gearing up for what we call our General Assembly. And so several people around the country are writing what we call overtures. And there's a number of environmental overtures, including fossil-free divestment overtures, as well as a number of other ones regarding climate change. So that's kind of a hot topic for us. And they're just statements that of fact and faith-based as well as research-based of things that we need to do as a country and globally to help protect the earth. So that's just kind of an aside here, but things that we always ought to be thinking about, not just at one time of year, but always working together to help mitigate climate change. And I'm from St. Joe, but I follow the lead of numbers of people in Kansas City, Kansas area and Kansas City, Missouri area that I really appreciate. You're all taking a really strong lead in eco-justice, soil, water, air, and I'm grateful for your leadership in many ways. So thank you.
Thanks, Diane. Well, you know, depending on our timing at the end, maybe we could take some moments to hear from other attendees, see what you all are doing in your communities and that sort of thing. But we want to leave plenty of time for Karen. And so our presenter tonight is Karen Ramsey. She's with Food Cycle KC. You probably saw her bio when I sent out the email, but we'll let Karen share a little bit more about herself when she gets into the presentation. But anyway, so without further ado, I turn it over to Karen, and you can get your slides going, and we'll look forward to hearing your wisdom that you have for us tonight. Thanks for being here, everyone.
Well, thank you, Chad. I definitely appreciate you all allowing me to come talk with you. I have always had kind of a love of environmentalism and sustainability, and about 2 years ago, I was volunteering with Climate Action KC here in town and had helped with the Climate Action Summit and was able to hear Paul Hawken, who is one of the editors of Project Drawdown, which is a fantastic set of research and information around climate action that we can take. So listening to him present is actually the inspiration for my husband and I to start Food Cycle KC in 2019. So that was a great opportunity to hear about how we could try to make a difference with climate and sustainability, and doing that through food composting. And that was really kind of the start for us, which is really helpful. And I'm very happy to be presenting to this organization, because at that same conference, one of the panels that I listened to had a speaker from the Sustainable Sanctuaries Speakers Bureau that was a participant. So that was really an interesting panel, and was my first introduction to this organization. So I'm excited to be able to talk with everyone today. So I will go ahead and share my screen. So everyone should be able to see my slides. So I am, thank you for the thumbs up, good to go. All right, I am, as Chad mentioned, co-founder along with my husband of Food Cycle KC, which is a local composting organization. So we, as with some other companies in the area, we collect food waste from local businesses and from residents. We take that to our farm in Eudora, where we convert it to compost. And then we provide that compost back to our members, and then also to local community and school gardens to help support community-based agriculture and growing. So we're focused really on some of the things that everyone was talking about before the meeting kind of started, talking about supporting soil and how that can impact the community, and being able to support community gardens, which are such a crucial resource, as I'm sure you all know already with the work that you do, such a crucial resource for helping reduce food insecurity in the area. So we're very excited to be part of that cycle and help in whatever way we can. So today, our exciting topic, because my husband and I have become kind of obsessed with composting over the last couple of years, is just some basic information about composting. And I'm sure you all may already, I don't know if everyone already composts, or if you're all kind of familiar with composting already. So feel free to jump in and share thoughts as I kind of hit the highlights or the basics of composting to introduce those topics. So I think the first question really is, what is compost even? Sometimes we'll have our members, you know, they'll contact us and say, hi, can I get my regular allotment of dirt this month? And so compost is most definitely not dirt. When we talk about the differences between those two things, dirt is more, sorry, my cat is here and you may be able to hear her. Dirt has more of those inert components like clay and small pebbles and that kind of thing, that is not really the organic materials that are needed to help feed plants and grow plants. That's really the organic component of that, is really what compost is. And it is in effect just material that has broken down enough that it's able to release its nutrients and release its material back to the plants that are growing in it. So that's a really quick and high level definition of that. The other thing, sometimes our members will kind of interchange terms. They'll talk about mulch, like, can we get some mulch from you? And again, a little bit different concept. Mulch is more the decomposed component, or the materials that are still holding on to their nutrients and haven't yet broken down enough to actually be compost and feed that nutrient back into the plants that would be growing through it. So those are kind of key components that we normally talk to people about. And then the other thing is, what is composting then? So composting is just a system of helping that organic material break down in a managed fashion. Everything will decompose eventually. If you have a pile of leaves in your backyard, they're decomposing, which is kind of natural, unmanaged composting, if you will. And eventually that will break down the same way that a compost pile or things that are being composted will break down. The composting process is following more structured metrics as far as what goes into that compost. So ideally, theoretically, that will break down faster and in a better manner than if you just weren't managing that process at all. So compost, really important component of gardening and agriculture and growing. Why? Aside from it being that fertilizer for those plants, which is really the most basic concept or piece of that whole process. As you were talking about with soil building earlier, compost is really the key component of how to build that soil. And we have so much soil loss when we look at tilled farming and, dirt that blows away, things that are not controlled for how the soil is treated. We lose a lot of that key topsoil and that layer of soil that has all of that good organic material. And so then we run into a lot of problems, not just with not being able to most effectively grow crops, but also the impact that it can have on how that soil and that material can actually manage manage stormwater, and how it can manage the materials that are coming into that area as far as like stormwater. You see, like if we have clay, which we have in this area a lot of times, if you've lost that organic matter in that layer of topsoil, clay will just not be able to absorb that water effectively. Whereas once you get that organic material into the soil, then you start to see it able to hold that water more effectively. That's another component of being able to help the soil fertility, not to mention protecting our watersheds and keeping less runoff materials from going into the water. So that building of the soil really has a lot of important impacts beyond just making it more fertile for growing. And then really when we start to see the other sustainable aspects of that, the food waste that we put into the landfill will just go into the landfill, and it will rot, and it will create greenhouse gases that are providing no value and are having serious impacts to the environment and to the atmosphere. Alternatively, if we take that same material and we use it to build the soil, and we sequester carbon into the soil and are reversing that issue with the contents being in the landfill, we're not just removing it from the landfill and preventing the greenhouse gases that are being created through the landfill. We're also having a net positive impact with additional carbon being sequestered into that soil. So it has a huge impact in a multitude of ways from a sustainability perspective. And it's not a small amount that we're talking about. When we look at the Johnson County solid waste plan, almost a quarter of what goes into the landfill today is straight food waste. It's something that's being thrown away, but could be a fantastic resource for us instead when we're looking at building our soil and being able to support local agriculture. So that's certainly a huge amount of waste that goes into the landfill just from food waste. And then when we look also at paper fibers, a lot of paper can still be recycled instead of going into the landfill, but there's certainly some component of that that maybe is not ready to be recycled or no longer could be recycled, but it could still be composted. So there's a huge amount of what materials are going into the landfill today that really could become a resource rather than being a waste product that we have to deal with. So composting in general, how does this work? So compost really requires three basic things. It requires the compostable materials, it requires moisture, and it requires oxygen or aeration. And if you get those three things in good balance, then you'll have microorganisms that move in and facilitate the composting process more effectively than if you just left things to decompose or rot on the ground. So in a well-balanced compost, you're getting that aerobic decomposition. So you're seeing what we would call hot composting or an exothermic reaction. So when we talk about compostable materials, there are two basic categories. They're what are called greens and they're what are called browns. So it's not based on the color of the item, it's based on what they're composed of. So greens are nitrogen-rich items. So things like food waste, fresh grass clippings, strangely, just because of the color perspective, coffee grounds are very high in nitrogen. For browns, that's items that tend to be higher in carbon. So those are things like dry leaves, wood chips, branches, and then things like newspaper or cardboard would also be considered browns. And when you are creating compost, you need to have kind of the right ratio. It's the recipe to have the right mix, right? So in general, at a high level, you want 1 part of greens per volume and then 2 to 4 parts of brown per volume. So just roughly, if I was putting in, an inch of greens, I would want about, twice that for my browns. So now when we talk about composting, we do have large-scale composting. Stan is here and he's representing Missouri Organics, which is the largest scale composting organization in the Midwest right now, I think. And we also do not nearly as large scale composting. But so with large scale or kind of commercial scale composting, the volume of materials that you get there are very conducive to being able to do that hot composting. You've got all those microorganisms working together. They're working on breaking those materials down. So it's a very aerobic and very exothermic reaction. So you can tell it's a hot compost pile when you go and you turn it, you can literally see the smoke coming out. And hot composting usually is at least 130 to 140 degrees and typically can reach much higher temperatures than that when it's really working. And when you're doing hot composting, it needs to stay at those high temperatures for an extended period of time. And depending on where the temperature is, that may be more days or fewer days. And that compost is managed in a few different ways. So this picture right here is just a picture that I pulled from the internet of what are called windrows. So these are tall piles of compost. You'll typically have like a large tractor related device that goes through and turns that compost material into itself so that the materials on the outside get moved into the inside where it's nice and warm, so those microbes can really work on it. And it's that constant turning that helps break those materials down more quickly. Another thing, if you're talking about large-scale composting, you may hear something about aerated static piles or aerated piles. So static piles are things, there's a few different ways to do this, but in a basic sort of way, a static pile means it's probably not being turned that way. But instead, to get that movement and that oxygen, it may have pipes to bring air in underneath the pile to move oxygen into the pile. And then you can get really fancy, and there are large devices, like I think the size of a shipping container, where the internal mechanism of that is maintaining and controlling the airflow and the moisture. So that's a little more, you know, got a little more workings to it versus just managing it as it's going. So that's kind of large scale composting, but let's talk then about small scale composting or home composting, which is probably more what you all are interested in. I apologize. So small scale home composting, depending on what you're doing, it can get hot. It can get to those temperatures where the microbes are breaking it down. If you're not, then that's more of a cold or a passive composting, which is more of an anaerobic reaction. You don't have those microbes helping break it down quite as quickly. And you have different methods for how you can do that at home. I'll kind of run through these different options. So one of the easiest ways is really to just start with a pile. If you throw a bunch of grass clippings and leaves on top of each other and you leave that there, they will eventually decompose and break down. You can start to manage that a little bit more if you ensure that the pile is large enough that it can start to get hot, and if you're turning it on a regular basis. Instead of just leaving it in a pile in your yard, you can also put it into a bin. Sometimes that's just more to keep it looking tidy, or also with the bin structure, you can then make sure that the pile is getting high enough and pulled together enough that it can start to compost more effectively. And then you can also go into like a multi-bin system, like a 3-bin system is very common. So this is kind of a picture of that, or what could be a 3-bin system, where you put materials into one bin and then you're able to move them to the next bin to get that stirred up, and again, get that outer material moved into the middle so that it can be broken down by those microbes more quickly as well. However you decide to do that, it's really just a matter of making sure that you have the content pulled together so that it is not just like spread out all over the ground. You want it building up to a size that is usually around 3 to 5 feet, so that that's enough to get that compost microbes working and getting hot. And putting those in a protected spot, like a shady location out of the wind, will help ensure that it's not getting blown through and having that wick away the moisture that it needs to be able to compost as well. And turning it, whether that means moving it from one bin to another or just taking a shovel and turning that compost over, is also crucial. That'll make sure that it's getting air back in there because it'll settle as it breaks down. and it'll also make sure that you're getting, again, that content on the outside moved into the middle so that it can break down more effectively. Now, if you don't like leaving the bins open, you have other alternatives to that too. And one note on this, you can see even from this picture, like a bin doesn't have to be a really fancy, you know, pre-made kind of bin. Like you can buy bins at the store, like at Lowe's or any home store that are pre-made plastic bins. You don't have to do that though. You can just put together a small, you know, bin like you see here. Some people will make bins out of pallets. They'll get old pallets and put 4 sides together. So it really is whatever materials you have available that will get you that space that's big enough and is easy for you to get into to get your materials turned on a regular basis. If you don't want to leave open bins like this, you can put a cover over the top of them, or you can go with something that's more kind of self-contained, like a tumbler. This is just a generic picture to give you an idea of what that looks like. So it's just a container. It's got closed, it's enclosed, and then it typically has a handle on the side so you can spin it rather than having to try to shovel your contents. And again, spinning it is intended to be able to get it aerated, so it's getting more oxygen in there, and then mixing your materials so that the microbes can get to it more effectively. This kind of container, you would probably want to turn more often. And again, that's not as hard since you're not having to use a shovel to do it. You can just go out there and spin it around. A lot of times people will have a multi-tumbler system so that once you fill up the first tumbler and you're waiting for it to finish composting, you can start filling up the next tumbler. So that's a similar kind of concept too with a multi-bin system where you don't want to keep adding and adding and adding to the same pile because then it never has a chance to break down. You want to be able to get a good pile, have it cooking, and then start the next pile and have it cooking as well. So these kinds of composting methods can take a while, especially if they're not getting hot. So home composting, you can expect that could take 6 months to a year sometimes to get that material broken down enough to use. And again, it just depends on if you can get it hot enough to compost quickly, and then what kind of material you're putting in there as well. Another kind of home composting option that's kind of fun for the kids, or if you live in an apartment and you can't have a compost pile, on your patio, that's frowned on for some reason. You can do vermicomposting, which is using worms to break down that food. Since it's a smaller container, that could be something that you could, do in your basement or somewhere in a small location. And basically, it's a multiple tier system where you're adding food at the top. The worms are eating that and breaking it down into worm castings, and then the good materials fall down to the bottom of the series of containers that you have. There are lots of containers on the market that are fancy, like this one that you see over in the corner. You can also just create a vermicomposting system out of buckets like you see here, or plastic tubs, like a Rubbermaid type of tub. So there's lots of instructions for those kinds of things on the internet to find out how you can do that. And that one's kind of fun. Like I said, if you have kids, like then they get to play with worms, and everybody likes to play with worms. Okay, so what can go in that compost container once you've got it all set up? Your fruits, your vegetables, if you have a stale piece of bread, old pasta. Coffee grounds and paper filters for coffee are fantastic. You can put eggshells in there. You want to be careful that you're not putting like, a lot of other, too many eggs in there potentially, because that could make the pile smell worse, or attract pests potentially. Things like shredded paper, leaves, grass. If you are putting grass into your home compost pile, you kind of have to watch that and make sure if it isn't getting hot enough, then those seeds that are in the grass may not break down appropriately. And then if you use that compost, like in your flower beds, you may see that cause some, grass to pop up here and there. But if the compost does get hot enough, eventually, if you've had it hot enough for long enough, that will kill most grass seeds, so that you won't have to worry about those growing again later. And you can put citrus. That's one we get asked a lot, like, is it okay to put citrus in my compost pile? You can put it in a home compost. A lot of people say maybe just to not put too much in there. Citrus you cannot do with vermicomposting. The worms can't handle that. And the other thing that you don't want to put in a home compost pile or vermicompost is meat or dairy. And the big reasons for that are, dairy and meat are going to be smellier potentially. They're more likely to bring in pests. And like if you put meat bones or something in your home compost, if it's not getting hot enough, then you're not going to be able to break those materials down in the same way that you could in a commercial or an industrial level compost facility. So when you talk about large scale composting, like what Missouri Organics does, what we do, all of these, meat and dairy is totally fine. That stuff will break down, perfectly fine in a large scale compost, commercial compost. Okay, so I put everything in my bin. I, put it in there, everything's going good. I forgot two important things that you need to have in addition to your organic materials, and that's the moisture and the air. So I talked about the air. That's part of why I'm turning it, why I'm shoveling it, while I'm tumbling it, is to get more air back in there. The other thing that's important is that you have enough moisture for it to break down. If you're doing food waste and you've got it in a protected location, you're probably getting a good amount or most of the moisture that you will need, because that food waste is going to be pretty wet. If you're not getting enough of that moisture, you can add a little bit of water to it, but you don't need tons and tons. It doesn't have to be showered on. And actually, if you get too much water in there, that's bad. So just having enough of that balance between the browns and the greens will get you a lot of your moisture that you already need. So I've had all those things in there. I've let it sit for however many months. I've turned it diligently. How do I know when it's ready to go? So when it's ready, you'll be able to tell because it'll look really good. It'll smell really good. When you look at compost, it's dark, it's rich, it's very earthy, it smells good. It smells like, some people say it smells like the ground after a rain. It smells just really rich. If it's not done yet, you can smell like an ammonia or kind of a sour smell. So you want to watch for that. If you had been doing hot composting, it will have started to cool down. And you should be back down to pretty close to, average air temperature. And again, that's with making sure you've turned that material into the center so that it's all getting attacked by the microorganisms. If it's still cooking, it will be hot. And again, it can get you want it to be at least in the 130 to 140 range. That's kind of the minimum for it to break down well. But it may be up in the 150s with home composting. With large scale composting, it can get even hotter than that. And then you want to make sure that everything's looking like it's breaking down. You won't have everything completely broken down. When you look at things like seeds or avocado pits, they may not have completely just broken into super small bits. But you don't want to see, you don't want to see a big chunk of pineapple in your compost. It should be getting to the point where it's not really recognizable, but you may have, a small stick here and there, that kind of thing that hasn't broken down quite yet. So how do I use compost? This one really sometimes stumps people because they're not really sure. Again, it's that dirt versus mulch versus compost. How do I really use it? So if you think about it in terms of compost is a natural fertilizer. So it's really eliminating your need to put those chemical commercial fertilizers on things. So in the garden, you can use a handful of it when you're planting to kind of target where you're putting the compost to feed that plant as you're planting it. You can add a little around the base of the plants as they're growing throughout the summer to give them kind of a boost of energy and nutrition. And then in the fall, you can go ahead and spread that compost on the top of your bed and let it work there. And then when it comes to spring and you're ready to till your garden, you can till it down into the garden to give it a overall boost of nutrition. Similar kinds of things when you're looking at flowers or perennials. So if you want to kind of loosen up that top level of soil and add some compost in around that perennial, that'll help feed it. And then you can do that in the fall as well. You can use it a little bit more like a mulch where you're maybe getting a thicker blanket of it to help protect that plant through the winter. If you have a lot of compost, you can actually use it to top dress your lawn. So basically top dressing is if you put a thin layer of compost across the top of your lawn and let it sink into the lawn to feed that. So you don't want to do very much because you don't want to, smother out your grass or your lawn. So you can do that in the spring or mid to late fall, like before the leaves fall around that time. And you just put a very thin, very small layer of compost over the top of the grass, and then it'll just fall down through the grass and feed the soil there. And then again, with potted plants, again, think of it as natural fertilizer. So if your soil for your potted plants is starting to get depleted, you can put some compost on the top of that potted plant and let that feed the nutrients down into the potted plant. Okay, so compost, when you're doing home compost, you definitely want to try to manage it, but it's okay because you're just taking a natural process and trying to move it along more quickly. So you don't have to feel like with home composting that you have to, be super exact about it and it always has to be measured and that kind of thing. It's really just kind of feeling the nature of the compost and nudging it in the right direction when it gets off track. So, and it will get off track, and it can get off track in a lot of different ways. So let's say you go out to your compost bin and it's super stinky. So what that probably means is you have too many greens, you have too much food waste in there. And so it's not being balanced out by that, that brown of leaves or dried grass or wood chips. So if your compost pile is stinky, you can just add more browns to it to help neutralize all the greens that are in there. Same thing, it may get slimy. You know, again, food, if you think about like food that's sitting out on the counter and rotting, it can get kind of gunky. Again, you just want to try to balance that out with your browns and get some more carbon in there. Maybe put some leaves on top of it, put some, you know, dry grass, those kinds of things. We like to call it a blanket, put a blanket of that on top, and then you can mix that in as well and get that balance back in place. If your pile is too small, you are going to have trouble getting it to really get going with that composting. So you want to make sure that you've got enough volume there that you're able to have that kind of 3 foot by 3 foot square pile is kind of the starting point that we typically recommend. If it's small, it'll still decompose. It just may not decompose as quickly because it won't have the ability to have the microbes working as hard. So, you know, if you don't have enough volume of material to really create a big compost pile, that's totally fine. You can go with that smaller pile and just realize that it's going to take longer to break down than you might like. Maybe it's not doing anything. Maybe it's just sitting there. So that could be the opposite problem where you've got too many browns, and so you don't have enough of those greens to really feed the microbes the way they need to. So you can try adding some extra food waste and see if that'll kind of kickstart it. Maybe you have a pile and it keeps drying out all the time. So that could be a couple of things. It could be that you've got, again, too many browns. So it's dry grass, dry leaves, and they're just kind of sitting there not doing anything, in which case you can add more of your greens that will have more of that moisture to keep it from drying out. The other thing might be where your pile is at. So if it's somewhere like out in, you know, bright, full sunshine every day, you've got the sun beating down on it, that's going to dry it out. Or if you're, you know, you have it somewhere maybe that it's just getting a lot of that wind blowing across it, and you've got an open bin system that you're using, that could be drying it out to some degree too. So maybe balancing your browns and greens, but maybe also looking at where you have it in position, that maybe you could move it somewhere less exposed in that regard. The flip side of that is it gets too wet. It's always wet, it's never dry. Again, that could be balancing your greens and browns to get more browns in there to help it dry out a little. But that could also be a positioning situation as well. Maybe you've got it somewhere where it's, you know, always getting a lot of rain. You could potentially put a top over it if you had the open bin to help keep some of the rain off of it. Or if you've put it under the eaves of the house and the water's running down on top of it, that could be adding more moisture than you need as well. So maybe putting a top on it instead of having that open bin are all good options to look at for how you have it set up. So that is Composting 101, quick and easy orientation to the basics of composting. So hopefully that's helpful information, and I'm open to hearing any questions, or if anyone wants to share, you know, your experiences with composting and compost, that would be great too.
This is Jerry. In the past year, we started curbside composting with Compost Collective.
Yeah.
And I understand there's another company called Kansas City Can Compost. What is your opinion of using them? You see them as competitors, or how do you look at it?
Well, I mean, certainly, so we offer the same kinds of services in general that Compost Collective does. So we are both offering curbside compost collecting. So we come to your home and we take the materials that you have and then we take them away to get them composted. There are some differences in service level, of course, but we're generally doing the same kind of thing. Casey Can, as far as I know, does not currently do curbside compost collection. They offer bin swapping where you take your bin to a designated location and you trade it out.
Okay.
You know, so yes, there is competition. You know, Kansas City has a fraction of 1% of households that are using or doing any kind of composting. So, you know, we're not fighting for the last market share in any way. There's plenty of opportunity for us and home composting. We just really want to encourage everyone to do composting because every bit that's taken out of the landfill is a resource to help, you know, grow things. So I think that's what I would say. And I think, you know, some people can't home compost. They don't have the time to do it. You know, they feel like it's gross or they just don't have time to do it. So, and I know actually some of our customers have come to us because their HOAs will not allow them to do composting.
Yeah.
So I think the services we offer really are just another opportunity, another way to help facilitate composting when you can't or don't want to do home composting.
One of the things I think that is difficult for a homeowner is, like you said, you can't, it looks to me like you have to set up multiple piles at different stages of composting to be effective. Because you said at some point you have to stop adding and let it do its thing. So you have to start another pile, another pile, another pile. At some point, maybe you get to the point where you don't have room for piles, so you have to throw it out.
I might take that one,
Yeah.
Karen.
Sure. Yeah.
No, don't mean to step on your parade, but no, my little four foot diameter pile takes all the food waste in my household all year. Because the thing that's kind of frustrating, but also true, is that about 65% of all the mass you put in the pile will vaporize as carbon dioxide as the bugs eat it. So it's depressing to fill the pile up and then watch it shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink because it's becoming more dense and rich. So yeah, it's I think the getting another bin was referring to the Tumbler situation.
Yeah.
I would think even with a pile without a tumbler, at some point you have to let that pile mature.
Well,
otherwise it's never going to complete its cycle, or it's, you know, it's never going to finish.
I can take that one again.
Yeah.
In a home pile, it's usually only working in the top 6 inches. You spread the food waste out across the top, add some brown to cover. You've got to cover the food waste or you'll have flies and rats and birds. Yeah. So you cover them up with some leaves or some shredded paper. And that upper layer is where the real active compost is. And then I like to say that the trickle down effect might work in business, but I know it works in compost. And so the compost is rich and thick and black in the bottom. And in the fall, just before the leaves fall, I'll open my bin, take the accumulated 2 feet or more of good black stuff in there. I'll screen some of it to be my potting soil and, you know, houseplant mix. And then I'll just dump the rest of it, like Karen said, on the garden, let it sit all winter, work it in the springtime. It's like coffee. It makes really good tea. You know, it's a rich black juice. So, and then the pile is effectively empty with a very thin working layer, and I'm ready for more leaves.
Compost Collector says that they'll take meat, bones, pizza boxes, and even fireplace ashes.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, so
one difference is the fact they will take meat and bones.
Right, and that's because of the fact that, and just like us, we will also take meat and bones and dairy and those kinds of things. And the reason for that is because with curbside compost companies like us, we're taking it to do it to compost it at large scale. So you're looking at facilities that are more controlled in how they're managing that waste. And the composting that we're doing is hotter and hot faster than what you can potentially do at home. So we can manage those materials, and at the scale that we're doing and that Missouri Organic is doing, it's getting hot enough that those bones will break down, versus at home, you can't get it to that hot enough temperature long enough a lot of times to be able to get bones to break down.
And you do take ashes from the fireplace?
We don't, we prefer not to take ashes in
Mhm.
our compost. That's there's small differences between what we will take versus Compost Collective versus Casey Can. So
Do you recommend scattering those over the yard then?
I would recommend doing that only occasionally.
Okay,
If you take fat from the pig and ashes from the fireplace and cook them together, you'll get lye soap. Ashes are extremely alkaline.
okay.
And,
and
you don't want too many.
and that's why we don't take them, is because, I mean, theoretically, you would not be receiving enough to impact the biology of the piles, but we're still at kind of, for a commercial level, we're at a smaller scale, so we can't, we just don't want to take that chance that we'll throw everything off.
So you put ashes in the landfill then? Is that what you do? Is that the responsible thing to do?
It's what I do.
For now.
Okay,
Go ahead.
all right.
Go ahead, Stan.
I like to sift out the charcoal.
Yeah,
I've run them through a 1/4-inch screen, and all the charcoal that stays on top is, I put it in a plastic sack and drive over it in my yard and crush it up and put
Oh
some
my God.
compost in it, add a little water, and I have biochar to
Mhm.
put charcoal at the bottom of my plants. So that's just me. So, but the clean
Yeah, and-
powder can go straight to the landfill.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. We're moving from one house to another house, and so we're going to have to leave our beloved compost. It's a kind of a square that broke down, but it's in an area. And I'm wondering about a tumbler, but I'm afraid to buy something that might fall apart. So I'm going to ask you if you have any suggested brands. And then I do have another question about vermicompost.
I don't have any suggested brands. I think the main thing would just be to look for things where the plastic feels or looks pretty sturdy, and then also the turning part, to make sure that the bar that is going through the tumbler that turns, that it looks like it's metal or not like something really flimsy. I know in the spring you can go to like the garden centers, and they'll usually have pretty good tumblers that you can look at there. So yeah, we don't use a tumbler.
Yeah.
So I don't really.
Yeah. Yeah. So now, on the vermicompost, can you, that probably won't tolerate being outside in the winter, right? It needs to be inside during the winter, right?
Probably. I mean, there are some vermicompost systems, I think, where they actually like dig down into the ground to try to encourage natural worm incursion composting. But yeah, generally, if you just have like a container, that's not enough insulation for them to be able to do well in the winter. I think you have to bring those indoors a lot of times.
40 to 80 degrees.
Okay.
That would not work today. You'd have to bring them inside today.
So Karen, I
So
have,
wait, a lot of people, yeah, sorry, I was just gonna say, a lot of people just bring them into their, their garage or their basement, and as long as it's not super cold, they'll be fine over the winter there.
Thank you.
so Karen, my question is, so, as you mentioned, the organic stuff going into the landfills creates, waste and methane and that sort of thing, which is bad. But why is the process bad in a landfill, but in your backyard it's good? I mean, is it creating the same amount? I mean, why is the process different in your backyard or at your commercial facility as opposed to being in the landfill?
Right. So the main difference is when you have that breaking down in the landfill, they have to cap that every day, to prevent odors and pests and that kind of thing. So the food in the landfill is breaking down anaerobically. It's breaking down without those healthy microbes. So what you're generating in the landfill is methane. And that methane is like 30 times more heat absorbing in the atmosphere than just regular carbon dioxide. So it's very huge impact on sustainability and on the environment. When you're doing it as compost and you're trying to balance all that out, ideally you're not creating methane for one thing, and it's breaking down more quickly than it would when it's trapped in that landfill. So you're having much less of those greenhouse gases that are being created, and they're less of the more potent versions of greenhouse gases that are being created.
What emissions
That's
are
the
you
biggest
creating?
thing.
What emissions are you creating?
It can potentially create some methane. It can create carbon dioxide. I don't remember if it's creating anything else, but those are the biggest things.
Yeah, it's a boatload of carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
But that's considered, I mean, it would all eventually become soil anyway. So, all of that carbon dioxide was, most of it, what doesn't remain as humus was always destined to go into the atmosphere. But if you get that 30% that remains as carbon, that's essentially fixed and can grow more. Folks, you're in good hands. I'm going to leave you now.
Okay. Well,
Great job.
I want to ask you about Kiss the
Thanks,
Ground,
Dan.
Stan. What is your
Yeah.
opinion of the movie Kiss the Ground and the message it sends?
It's a wonderful message. It's regenerative agriculture, and it's, in my opinion, one of the greatest hopes of mankind.
Yeah, that's the impression I get.
Right.
But this rich soil actually captures carbon.
Absolutely.
You talk about, CO2 maybe emits a bit, but it's also capturing carbon, sequestering it, right?
Right. Actually, it's called the liquid carbon pathway. Carbon dioxide in the air is absorbed by plants. It's turned into liquid. So gaseous is turned to liquid sugars in the plant, which are pushed out into the roots, which cause explosion of bacterial and protozoas and all kinds of life there. That carbon is eaten, pooped, belched, and effectively turned into humus at the soil level. So it goes from gas to liquid to solid and is sequestered pretty much long-term if it's not plowed.
Yeah.
And eventually mineralized into nitrate in the soil.
Yeah.
So,
And
yeah.
roots that
think
go very deeply into the soil.
Right.
And
I
Stan,
think
has
one
your,
of the other things. Sorry, Chris. I was just going to say regarding Kiss the Ground, I think one of the other important aspects of that too is the idea of community-based composting, which really feeds into the idea of community-based agriculture. So, the way we manage solid waste today is so dysfunctional. You throw it in a truck and then you truck it, 10, 20, 30, 40 miles away, which is fine for solid waste. It is what it is, because we don't really have any other options for it. But when we start talking about composting, like compost is not waste. It's a resource that we don't take advantage of right now. So why not keep that resource where it's made and then turn it into, you know, something that can be used for community gardens in that area, or, you know, local regenerative agriculture in that area. So I think that's the other thing that's really great about, like, you know, LA Compost and looking at how they're doing things is they're not trucking it all over the country. They're keeping it right where they find it, and leveraging it to help their community. So I think that's a really important message there too.
Yeah, I might mention that we donate $60,000 a year worth of compost to nonprofits and churches and community gardens. And we're hosting on March 19th, the first ever nationally Compost Fest. And the link is in the chat. And we'll be building perhaps on the order of an 80 cubic yard pile at Westport Gardens in 39th and Warwick in Midtown. And the morning is a build, and the afternoon is an educational session. So all that's
What's
on
that date again?
March 19th, Saturday.
Okay.
So
Stan, I just want to tell you a funny story. Is it your organization that has a place up north here on North Main?
yes.
Okay. I thought I might have my names wrong. That's Missouri Organics, right? So I had a bunch of leaves and sticks that I needed to dispose of, and I thought, you know, and so I went online and looked up and thought, oh, interesting, North Main. So it's like right downtown. And I went driving up there, and it's like I ended up in, you know, the vast prairie.
Smithville or worse. Yeah.
Yeah. It was just kind of funny. It's like, well, duh.
Look for the Shoto location.
Yeah.
That's down on the river by the casinos.
Yeah.
What do you
Well, I
think
like
of,
this one's actually closer. So that was nice. Yeah.
What do you think of nutshells like walnuts, peanuts, pistachios? Are they compostable?
Definitely for our compost. Again, for home composting, you'd have to make sure that you're getting it hot enough that you could try
Yeah.
to break those down.
So it's kind of like doing bones, I suppose.
Not quite that much, but yeah.
Okay. All right.
So Karen, another question I have for you is, so, you know, this idea of composting as an environmental benefit for sustainability. I mean, you're driving a truck, I'm assuming, through to pick up your bins. I mean, do you all do something to try to offset that effort? That
Right. Yeah, definitely driving the truck to do the pickups is one way that we're not operating exactly where we would like to. I mean, all of the companies end up driving trucks around. Hopefully at some point we can transition to using electric vehicles, which would be a huge impact. When we do the analysis and we look at you know, what the trucks are producing versus what we're diverting from the landfill, even though it's not ideal, we're still saving and reducing greenhouse gas emissions because that methane that's created in the landfill is so much more potent. It's still offsetting that. But yes, in the future, we will be very excited to move to electric vehicles, and then we can really make a huge difference with the amount of greenhouse gas that's being produced.
Could you also put your website in the chat, Karen?
Yes,
If it's not
I will
already
do
there.
that.
Okay.
I will do that right now.
Okay.
Yeah. Are there other questions for Karen? Chris?
I have a couple. I guess the one was about HOAs, because they seem to be standing in the way of all kinds of things, solar panels and stuff. But you're saying basically you're offering them a solution because of the curbside. Is that right? So you actually can outreach to or vice versa.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. And I had a question with Chad's about the methane and, you know, what's different between the landfill. So thank you for answering that. That was good. And also, is there a decision tree online for what's wrong with my compost. I had actually in St. Louis, I had a backyard one in a small garden, you know, and we'd pull from the bottom and add to the top. And, you know, it lasted for many years pretty well. We had some varmint that would come along underneath and kind of clean up. Then here, I live at a place where I can't do anything outside. So I had the worms. Except after about a year, I killed them. So I'm going to have to start over. But is there some kind of an infographic that can just to go to for if I get into it again? For what's wrong? If this,
yeah, I will look. We have some resources on our website. I don't know if I have anything exactly like that, but I can certainly pull something together and post it, and I can send it out to everybody here too.
And then I have one more kind of off the wall. I grew up on a farm in Kansas, and shout out to the Land Institute. I just happen to have their shirt on. And of course,
that's my shirt, Chris.
What?
Yeah. So that's my shirt.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, good. And now on the farm, we did what is done too much now with CAFOs, which is raw manure. You know, we were doing small smatterings of it, which wasn't a problem. And I understand that, you know, heat wise, it needs to be composted before it's spread on fields, which all the CAFOs are doing terribly. But one other aspect I want to ask about, because of that rural background, is whether I had a friend in St. Louis who was really into gardening and composting. And she was secretly doing humanure. And that was kind of one of her big things. And I looked into it at the time and realized that it was being used in some more like third world situations where it was there wasn't the money to go and put in plumbing anyway. But the more I researched it, the more I came to realize that in the long term, the idea of using water-based plumbing to get rid of our waste was actually very wrong-headed, probably. And that under duress, if you were, you know, if you get wiped out or something, town from a tornado or whatever, I don't know what would be the situation, that maybe rethinking that completely would be a good idea. But then I thought about, what about just plain rural areas where you're using what do you call it? I forgot the word for it. What?
Tanks and lagoons.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Septic. That's what I was thinking of.
Yeah, lateral fields. From
Are anybody actually developing that in the U.S. for rural situations where they want to get rid of their septic tank and they can't do a lagoon or whatever? Is that a viable option?
So
to end up with usable, the idea would be to end up with usable compost.
Right. So, I mean, from a material perspective, you know, it's not necessarily that much different than animal manure. But the problem with it is there's so many pathogens and disease vectors, and, you know, using that opens up all kinds of potential issues around health. Exposing yourself to it as it's processed, or even, you know, as you're using it. So, you know, under duress, like there are places where it is used, and I have seen, you know, some books and articles about it as an option. But I would say here in the U.S. with, you know, our plumbing and our systems that we have in place, it's probably not the best path to take right now. I mean, there's so much other low-hanging fruit with just food waste and animal manure that could be used that like that would be pretty low on the list of things.
Yeah, I understood that unless you were having to totally revamp your system or go somewhere and start anew, or you're out in the middle of nowhere, you know. Right. And I thought that it was mostly a temperature-based problem, but is it more than that, that you had to get up to really high temperature, which at that point you might have to use fuels to do that, but unless you did it right.
Right. Well, I mean,
Yeah,
theoretically,
right.
yeah, if you had the temperatures, but you know, even at commercial scale composting, like there are still people involved in that process. So, you know, it hasn't broken down at that point. You're running into a lot, you're creating a lot of risks where, you know, for us, we're blessed to like have all kinds of other resources that would probably be a better starting point for composting versus that particular resource.
I heard, it might be a myth, but I heard one of the problems with using human waste is it's tomato seeds don't get broken down. So if you spread it, all of a sudden you've got a field full of tomatoes plants where you may not
Well,
want them.
and again, I think that goes back to like when you're composting, you have to have a high enough temperature for a long enough period of time to kill seeds.
Yeah.
And some of that too actually is moisture. So when you're composting, if you have it at the right moisture levels, you know, it's just like when you plant seeds in the spring, you know, they need to get, some seeds need to get wet so that that's kind of the trigger to soften the outer container of the seed itself. So like keeping your compost pile at the right moisture level will also help break down some of those seeds and make sure that they're not viable anymore once they're out of the compost. And I think there was a question, someone had asked if they'll be able to get the slides, and I had sent them to Chad. So Chad, if you wanted to send them out.
Yeah, if you email me, whoever wants to slide, if you just want to email me, then I will send them to you. And you can email
And another
me.
thing too,
I'll put my email in the link in the chat.
okay.
I'm still looking for your website. I don't see it here in the chat.
In the chat, I did put it in there. It's foodcyclekc.com. Oh wait, no, sorry. I
Did you
didn't
send it
realize
just to
I was
one
just,
person instead of everybody?
yeah, I
Okay.
did. The person who asked for it here. There we go.
Okay,
And another
good.
thing I was going to mention too is, since you all are, you know, potentially affiliated with organizations like churches and sustainable sanctuary, that kind of thing. One thing that we're doing with Smooch, with Shawnee Mission Unitarian Universalist,
Yeah.
they actually have a compost. We service their food pantry, so that any food that they can't use at the pantry goes into one of our commercial bins, and we collect that and take that. And what they're actually working on as a pilot with their congregation too is they have allowed their congregants to get one of our regular residential buckets that they can fill up, and then they can bring that to church with them, and they can empty that bucket into the church container that they already have for the food pantry. So kind of creating a center of composting that the congregants can use is another kind of creative way, another way that we're looking at trying to maximize people being able to compost in different ways if they can't do home composting, or if they're not able to do, you know, a home compost service like ours.
Do you do both pickup in Kansas and Missouri?
We are actually focused on the Kansas side right now, and partially to, you know, make sure that we're not trying to drive all over town and keeping our miles down
Right.
to help reduce that impact. But also partially just because, you know, we wanted to make sure that we're kind of supporting the Kansas side of the community, which is where we're at right now, obviously.
Okay.
So
Where are you located again?
we're in Shawnee, Kansas,
Shawnee. Okay.
so on the west side. Mhm.
West Shawnee. Are you inside the 430 loop or beyond it?
Just inside.
Okay.
Karen,
Yeah, I just brought up your website. I'm looking at it, so.
Karen, I was
So you do
curious.
both residential and business, looks like, in
Yes.
Kansas.
Yes. Yeah. And sorry, Gary, what was your question?
That's all right. I wanted to ask about if you're using grass clippings, how do you deal with lawn chemicals?
So, so some people think that or say that the chemicals will disperse or after a certain amount of time. Some of that just depends on what particular chemicals you're using. I would say, you know, if you want to compost and you want to put it on your plants and keep your plants healthy, if you're putting chemicals on your lawn or, you know, like herbicides specifically, I would probably not put those grass clippings into my compost if they have herbicides on them, just because you want to make sure that you're not going to end up killing the plants that you like if they hadn't, you know, broken down sufficiently.
Okay, thanks.
I know some lawn services will spot spray instead of doing an entire area. And grass clippings, I tend to mulch instead of collecting a bag. So I'd have to come back and rake some clippings to add to the compost pile in that case, right?
I mean, you could, it depends a lot again on what's being sprayed on the lawn. So you probably just want to double check that. And if they're spot spraying something that's not going to, you know, disperse sufficiently, then you probably don't want to risk the chance that you pulled up some of that grass clipping.
Right.
All right, any other questions for Karen? All right, well, Karen, thank you so much for presenting tonight. I think your presentation was well timed with kind of the spring weather that we've been getting a hint to. And so her website is www.foodcyclekc.com. And so if you are
And it's in the chat there.
Yep, it's in the chat. So if you're interested in learning more or wanting to get pricing, I'm sure Karen will be happy to give you more information. And so we'll have our next presentation the first Monday of April 4th, and that will be on soil. What's the topic, Jerry? Soil health stands.
Diane, do you know what they're calling that? What Jim Turner is calling it?
I was going to look here. I have it.
Okay.
Soil regeneration. I mean, that's the broad topic.
Okay.
So anyway, so and if you all have a topic that you would like to have presented, then we, you know, definitely are always welcoming folks to be presenters. And so keep your ears open and have them send Jerry or I an email, or you guys can reach out to us and let us know that you have a potential presenter and topic. And
I think we have tentatively scheduled Chick Keller for the first Monday in May on climate change. But I think last week when we were listening to Mary Silwas, the wife of the guy that does the Giving Grove was on.
Right.
And she kind of thought that he might, if we pressed him, he might be willing to talk about the Giving Grove, which is now multi-city. Started in Kansas City, it's now multi-city.
Yeah, Giving Grove is fantastic. We actually we planted a Giving Grove orchard on our farm this year, and it's an amazing organization.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Karen. Oh, yes, Chris.
Is there a part 2 to the deconstructing sustainability?
Yes,
No.
Mary,
Scheduled.
she couldn't present tonight.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, she's wanting to present in the future. So Be on the lookout for that. If
Okay.
in the chat, you'll see my email. Let me put another thing in the chat. If you'd like to, if you're not signed up for our email newsletter from Sustainable Sanctuary, that's how we advertise all these events. And I can sign you up, but I can also, well, I'll just put a link to our website. And then if you scroll down here, I'll show you here. I'll share my screen quickly here and show you where you can sign up. But I'll put this in the chat. So you can go to the website that you find in the chat, and then let me share my screen. And then, so share. So if you go to our website, which is the link I gave you, and you scroll down to the right, there's an e-news sign up. You can put your email, first name and last name, and hit subscribe, and you can do that. You can also donate to Sustainable Sanctuary by clicking on donate. So I'd love to have that. If you click on the upcoming events on our website, that's another way. If you click on that, that takes you to our Facebook page. And you can see here we are tonight with Composting 101 by Food Cycle KC. So you can see upcoming events and that sort of thing if you click on the upcoming events. Or you can go straight to our Facebook site page under Sustainable Sanctuary Coalition and find all that information out. Or you can email me and I can let you know. So,
Chris, did you learn about this through me or through Chad's email?
Through your email.
Okay.
Yeah, and I
Okay.
had to miss last week, and I was trying to get back into the rhythm of catching these things. I have
Yeah.
had conflicts all along, and now they're alleviating a little bit on Monday.
I
nights.
think Chad recorded that, didn't you?
I did,
Ah.
yeah. So,
Oh,
and
that would be good.
Yeah, and so I need to create a link on our webpage about those videos.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've sent that out to folks before, but I will definitely get something created on our Facebook, on our
Great.
website.
Yeah, because I still will have occasional Monday conflicts, but I was
Yeah.
trying to get back to. I do actually read them when you send those emails.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. I want to respect your time. It's just about 8:30, and so it's a good time to call it quits for tonight. Karen, thank you so much for presenting, and we really enjoyed it. And
Thanks
learned
very much.
something. And
Thank
yeah,
you.
and so if without further ado, thank you all for coming and have a great evening.
There, we give a thumbs up there.